So we're going to continue on. We started last week talking in this series entitled Letters to Leaders. And net effect, here's what Letters to Leaders is all about. This is the central thread throughout the entirety of this collection of messages is that Christians, spiritual leaders, but more importantly by the term Christians in the world, are supposed to demonstrate in the world what God desires for all people. Christians at every level of organization are supposed to demonstrate for the world what God desires for all people. In other words, we're supposed to live in such a way that other people can look at our life and see it, even in our behavior at work per se, and say there's just something a little bit different about that particular individual, and I want to know what that difference is. And so Letters to Leaders assumes that almost all of us in this room at some point in our life have had an opportunity to look at Jesus, and he has called us spirit to spirit and invited us to be redeemed, to be transformed, to follow him, to see what it means to look more like Jesus every day and less like I am naturally. It assumes that all of us have had that opportunity and that we're doing our very best to follow him. Because Christians are spiritual leaders, and spiritual leaders, as we're going to talk about today, do one thing, and this is the whole point of today's message is that spiritual leaders care for the most vulnerable people in the world. Spiritual leaders care for the most vulnerable people. Let me change it just a little bit. They care for the most vulnerable people in our worlds. In other words, spiritual leaders care for the most vulnerable people in their 8 to 15. You never forget that we have this 8 to 15 people in our life that God's trying to connect with. And so for us, we're going to kind of back into that basic point a little bit further this morning. And we're going to say that we care about others, friends, because God first cared about us. We recognize that if you left us to our own devices, and I don't think we'd ever say this out loud, but if you left us to our own devices, God might be just one of the things in our lives that we focused on rather than the primary thing that we focused on. In fact, if you leave it to me by Tuesday, something else would probably occupy my time if it weren't for the fact that God continues to transform my life. And God did it of his own initiative, right? God didn't ask my permission. We didn't have to bargain for it. It's out of the sheer gratuity of God's grace. He extends grace to us. He acted because he wanted to act on our behalf. He invited us to love him because he wanted to love us first. He didn't wait on me to grow big and tall, to be able to do flips, to get as handsome as I've gotten right now in my life. He wasn't waiting on any of those things for me. He said, if you'll have me, I'll have you. End of story. And he did it because he wants to love me and he wants to love you. Is that the whole point of being a spiritual leader is we recognize that if you left it to us, we wouldn't be probably that lovely, and God would say, no thanks. But God chose to look at us and say, it would be easier to make a new one than it would be to clean you up, but let me just go ahead and redeem you anyway because I love you. So we recognize that God acted purely on his own behalf. For in fact, we have a thing that separates us from God. We don't like to listen. We don't like to bend our knee or bow our attention to what God invites us to do. But remember, Scripture again tells us from 1 John, our series we covered several weeks ago. 1 John said it this way, is that in this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to atone for the sacrifice of our sins. In other words, God went first. God looked at us, and God went first. God chose to love us when we chose to love everything but God. And for those of us in this room that have given our life to the Lord and have heeded that call of the Spirit, is we recognize that we care for the most vulnerable in our worlds because God cared for the most vulnerable, and one time I was part of that most vulnerable. I was defenseless. I was hopeless. I was helpless. And in fact, that's sort of how you define vulnerable. Webster's defines vulnerable this way. They say that vulnerable is capable of being physically or emotionally wounded. Anybody got any physical or emotional wounds in here? I didn't think so. or open to attack or damage. Every time I have to chase down one of the boys at Frisbee, I open myself up to attack or damage because he runs like a gazelle and I run like Eeyore. And it's awful. And I recognize that more and more I am vulnerable in my life. And that's the whole point of Christian spirituality, friends, is to recognize that by default, by being made human, you're made vulnerable. In fact, I'm convinced that on another day we'll cover this. I'm convinced that vulnerability has everything to do with being made in the image of God, because being made in the image of God means that we can love. And the only way you can love is to expose yourself to emotional or physical wounds. And when He chose to love us, this is my whole point here that I'm trying to continue to drive home with you. God chose to, of His own volition, make Himself vulnerable to the very people that would in turn crucify Him. He chose of His own volition to be vulnerable, friends. And when He went first on our behalf, we look at Jesus and we live after the model of Jesus. So when spiritual leaders, when you hear me say that we care for the most vulnerable people in our worlds, it's not because we're got the do-gooder syndrome. It's because we recognize that Jesus exposed Himself to a danger, to attack. Yes, in fact, He exposed Himself to the very thing that took His life on our behalf, so that we could experience the very grace that we sing and celebrate about this morning. Spiritual leaders, friends, are people who go first because God went first. And we're defenseless and helpless. The most vulnerable in our worlds are defenseless and helpless. And we know what that's about, because sometimes our own brokenness still renders us that way, defenseless and helpless. And it's not bad to be that way. I'll move on from the point. It's not bad to be part of the most vulnerable in the world. It's not bad to be defenseless and helpless. That just means you're the kind of people that God invites into relationship. Romans says it this way. He says that Paul's writing to the Romans, and he says that Abraham could not swear by himself. He had to swear by somebody greater than himself. Why? Because that's what grace is about. I'm paraphrasing just a little bit. Because he says that if we earn God's grace, if in other words we were defendable and not helpless, then receiving God's grace would be God paying us something that was deserved to us. And Paul says, but in net effect, 21st century language, you've lived in your shoes long enough to know that if God's grace depends on you doing something to deserve it, because if you've heard me say before, and I bet it's not true for you, it's just true for me, I'm the only one that's been present in every stupid thing I've ever done in my life. Me. And so if it were up to me to do enough to earn God's grace, He'd owe me a favor. And that's not what grace is. So it's not bad to be helpless and defenseless. That just means that we're the kind of people that God is after. In other words, Paul says it this specific way: for while we were still helpless. Oh, I love this. Romans 5, while we were still helpless, at the right time Christ died for people like me and you. And that's how God demonstrates His love for us. In that while we could not get to Him, while we were still yet broken and sinful, Christ gave His life for us so that we could get back to God. God goes first. And in fact, if you read the New Testament, here's what it says: that Jesus has a penchant for life's most vulnerable people. I promise we'll get to the Timothy text in a minute. That Jesus has a penchant for life's most vulnerable people, and He had a tendency to refer to them, particularly in Matthew, in the first gospel of the New Testament. Matthew chapter 25, Jesus refers to life's most vulnerable people as the least of these. And here's the categories that he uses in Matthew 25: the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and those that are imprisoned. But listen, if you look at that list and you live much of life, you'll notice that most of that on that list and much of the things that happen to us in life have this tendency for us to say, well, but what'd they do? I mean, really, what'd you do to get hungry? How come you don't have anything to drink? What about being sick? I mean, just take care of yourself. You won't be sick. Now, there's this thing about us in life. We live enough experience and we recognize, friends, and this is the hard part about where we're backing into spiritual leaders. We care for the most vulnerable in our society. We have to kind of recognize that we have this tendency to experience enough disappointment, or there's this thing, big high-powered term, you don't care too much about it this morning, called attribution error, that says that when we see somebody else having a problem in life, we look at them and go, well, must be something they did. This is the way it is. We have enough experience in life that it says that. And when Jesus cared for the least of these, sometimes the least of these are usually the least valuable because we have enough life experience that says they probably did something to get in that position. I'm just being honest. It happens to me. It happens to everybody. Right? Because we have this tendency to run up the ladder of ascent in our mind and think, well, if you're naked, then you must not work. Or if you're in prison, then just don't break the law. I mean, that's not hard. And it's the hard thing about caring for the most vulnerable in our worlds is because we sometimes, our brokenness, those unredeemed portions of our own life, sometimes get in the way and have a hard time. They keep us from being able to be spiritual leaders in the way in which Christ invites us to. In other words, sometimes our own brokenness, our own unredeemed portions of our soul keep us from connecting with some of our 8 to 15. And could it be that one of your 8 to 15 is hungry, thirsty, a stranger to you right now, naked, sick, or in prison? I don't know. But what I do know is that the most vulnerable in our society, too, are often the least visible. And this is where we get into our text today. I'm going to go through it real quick. And what Paul's writing to his friend Timothy again, and he says this particular thing. He's encouraging Timothy on how to lead in a church that Paul started. And so he encourages Timothy in verse 3 of chapter 5, 1 Timothy chapter 5. Honor widows who are widows indeed, and if any of the widows have children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and make some return to their parents. In other words, some people, they had a list of widows in the church, and the widows were put on the church's official list to care for them. But what Paul's saying is that some people have family that can care for them, and the church don't need to care for them. And you should make sure that if they come on the official widows list, that they're someone who really has no other option, but if the church didn't care for them, they would not be cared for. And so when he says children or grandchildren, he's suggesting that if you have family, the family should tend to this person instead of the church first. And now, verse 5, now she who is a widow indeed, in other words, has no family, and who's been left alone, has fixed her hope on God and continues to entreat, or some translations say, pray for day and night. But she has also given herself to, but she who has given herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Again, this talks about people who had come on the list that had not really, they had another way of surviving, but they weren't living that way. So prescribe these things as well, verse 7, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those in their own household, remember household, remember from our 8 to 15 oikos term? Same term. Same term right there. So in other words, it would say, especially those of your own 8 to 15. They have denied the faith and are worse than an unbeliever. Oh, thanks, Paul. It makes us feel good. A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one husband, having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up her children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the feet of saints, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to put younger widows on the list. Ladies, this isn't a thing. Again, this has to do, and Paul will articulate it here, for when they feel sensual desires to disregard Christ, and that they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside the previous privilege. So it appears that what was happening is some younger ladies had gotten on the widow's list, and that they had decided that living a life of a dedication to Jesus would take a back seat to being dedicated to a new husband. And they had basically abandoned faith, in other words, what Paul's writing to. So it's not that young ladies shouldn't go on the list. He just says that they've had some experience that it hasn't worked out too good. At the same time, same ones, you'll see what he's talking about. He gives some context for his comment. He says they become idle. They go around from house to house, not merely idle, but they're gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. And so, again, he's saying that it wasn't necessarily living a life given to spirituality. Therefore, I want younger women to go back and be married again, bearing children, keeping house, giving enemies, not giving enemies, and give the enemy no occasion to reproach, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. He finishes his thought. If any woman is a believer has dependent widows, in other words, a mother-daughter relationship, she must assist them in the church and must not be burdened, so that they may assist those who are widows indeed. And then we won't finish that one in the essence of time this morning. So, who are the most vulnerable that Paul points out from 1 Timothy? Since we're talking about spiritual leaders care for the most vulnerable in our worlds, let me summarize what he said in all that language as we got some context. Number one, widows, or those who have lost their spouse. As we talked about last week, it's not limited to just women or just men. Is that anyone who has lost their spouse and is genuinely alone in the world is someone that spiritual leaders are focused on or commanded to care for in the world. Second one, he said, was single parents or grandparents. He says spiritual leaders notice the most vulnerable in our society. My grandmother, my dad's mom, was a single parent. My granddad took his own life. And my dad came up without a dad. And I've heard stories my whole life of what it was like to work in the church but not be able to be part of the church because a single mom had to do everything she could do just to support the two of them. And I bet some of you have stories like that, or you know people who have stories like that. And it's commendable that to spiritual leaders, we're supposed to care for the least visible people in society. And oftentimes they're the least visible because they're just on the periphery of life. And single parents or single grandparents are one of those. A third one that Paul kind of mentions by way of implication are those who are aged or disabled family members. Often the least visible people in the world. And that spiritual leaders care for the most vulnerable people in our worlds. Some of those are the upwards. Like this particular one, folks, those of you in here who are doing it, like taking care of your parents, who their health is failing or have done it, have gotten to a point where it was very difficult to do. This is the commendation that Paul is making to all of us, is that spiritual leaders care for the most vulnerable people in our worlds, and that one of those sometimes becomes your own parents or a disabled family member sometimes. Another one that he's suggesting is the economically and or spiritually poor. And sometimes it's easy for us to focus on the economically poor. They sort of stand out in certain venues. But sometimes we overlook the most marginalized people in our own lives, and our own 8 to 15 are the spiritually poor. Because they look as normal as we do. Whatever normal is. But Paul's commendation for us is that spiritual leaders look after those who are both economically and spiritually poor as well. Next one, he says that we're supposed to look after unwanted or abandoned children. And always, Jansen and I will watch TV from time to time, and there'll be that, is it the APS, the pet commercial. They have the dog on there that's been abused or that they've rescued animals. And I just look away because I don't want to have to give my man card back to my daughter. She's more brilliant and more emotionally intelligent than I am, and so she just breaks into tears when she sees it because she's always asked the same question: how could people do this to animals? And the question I always have is, how can people do it to children? We don't have pictures of children on TV, friends, like this. But Paul says spiritual leaders are people who look after abandoned and unwanted children. Even when we've raised our own children sometimes. And the last one, and this one isn't on there, I add this one on because it's just so you can discount this one if you want. I'm nowhere like Paul. But I think one of the things that spiritual leaders, one of the most vulnerable peoples that we're supposed to look after are indigenous people too. This one's one that flies under the radar. Native Americans. My encouragement to you sometimes would be to go to a reservation and look at the general culture of a reservation. Where little girls don't want to grow up and be too pretty because they got a 2 in 3 chance of being raped before they get out of high school. Friends, indigenous people sometimes are overlooked, and the reality is that we all got here some way other than being born here, by way of heritage. Right? Indigenous people are people that God gives for spiritual leaders to be sensitive to and pay attention to just as much as anybody else as well. Because spiritual leaders, again, friends, we care for the most vulnerable people in our worlds. And we'll finish our time up this morning by saying this one thing. Those of you who are familiar with Ivan Misner, he began an organization called BNI. And it's a business networking institution. And I don't know if Ivan's Christian, and it really doesn't matter to me. Because he has this great line that is completely Christian. He says, you participate in BNI because givers gain. That's his line. Givers gain. And you want to know why we pay attention to the most vulnerable people in society? Because when you give care, friends, that's when you actually get care. It's not that we first loved God, but he first loved us. We get care from him first in order that we can give care to others. Friends, that you actually, spiritual leaders, actually gain in your spirituality, actually gain in what it means to be given to a life conformed to the image of Christ for the sake of others when we give the very care that we want to receive from others. Givers, beloved, gain. And in fact, Jesus models it for us this morning in the elements. There's no other way to do this, is that he gained the whole world. Like he created the whole world. And he turns and gives himself to you once again this morning. For this is what he knows. That if you'll continue to be conformed to his image, if you'll give yourself to him, he actually gains too. He gains one more person that knows him, that loves him, that continues to better be able to model what it means to be Christian, and so that you can demonstrate for the world what God desires for all people. So when you receive the elements this morning, friends, you're living into this final principle that givers actually gain. For Christ will actually gain when you come to the table this morning. He will gain an opportunity to look you in the eyes once again. He'll gain an opportunity to remind you that you are everything he says you are. You'll gain the opportunity to look him in the eyes and hear him give you the commission once again to go and engage with those 8 to 15 people that are in your sphere of influence that he wants to reach. And he gives you that assignment that you might gain the calm assurance that is yours, that you have everything you need to do the work that God invites you to do.